before a single shot was fired in the trenches of World War I. The most lethal weapon of the 20th century was already loaded and primed in secret off the coast of Georgia. Its trigger was pulled on a quiet winter night, the first night of Hanukkah, just 2 days before Christmas. A carefully timed gift to the architects of the Federal Reserve and the Wilson administration. It was certainly no festive present for the public, but rather a calculated political trap. While ordinary Americans were distracted by holiday preparations, lawmakers were frantically rushing out of Washington to catch trains home, and an empty Congress left zero room for opposition. Pushing the final stroke right at that moment ensured no last-minute filibusters or public protests could stop it. But for Wall Street, it was the ultimate strategic gift, the green light to an infinite fountain of credit. Act 1. The ghost of central banks passed. To understand why America spent generations terrified of a central bank, and how it finally built one anyway, we have to step back into the 19th century. For the first 100 years of the United States, the idea of a single, powerful financial institution steering the national economy was toxic. Americans had already tried it twice, and both times they felt it looked too much like a financial monarchy. First came the First Bank of the United States in 1791, followed by the Second Bank in 1816. Both were modeled after the Bank of England, holding government funds, issuing paper currency, and attempting to regulate smaller banks. Both were fiercely loathed by the public. Farmers, frontiersmen, and working-class citizens saw these institutions as tools of the East Coast elite, monopolies that hoarded gold, crushed local growth, and answered to no elected official. Enter President Andrew Jackson. In 1832, facing the renewal of the Second Bank's charter, Jackson drew a line in the sand, declaring war on what he called such a concentration of power in the hands of a few men, irresponsible to the people. Jackson vetoed the charter. By 1836, the Second Bank was dead, its assets dispersed, and the federal government officially washed its hands of central banking. For the next 80 years, America ran on a free-for-all. Thousands of independent state banks printed their own paper notes, backed by varying amounts of gold, silver, or sheer optimism. It was an era of explosive, chaotic growth. Railroads stretched across continents. Steel mills roared, and fortunes were made overnight. But there was a fatal flaw in the machinery without a central lender of last resort. The entire system was a house of cards. Whenever panic struck, there was no safety net, just a long, terrifying drop. Act 2. The turn of the century and the pressure cooker of 1900. As the calendar flipped to the year 1900, the United States was transitioning from an agrarian republic into an industrial titan, producing more steel, oil, and goods than old European powers. But its financial plumbing was stuck in the Dark Ages. The U.S. economy was plagued by structural rigidity, with the money supply rigidly tied to the availability of government bonds and gold reserves. When crop harvesting season arrived in the autumn, farmers in the Midwest needed massive amounts of cash to move their crops to market. Under the fragmented system of the time, banks in New York City, the nation's financial hub, held the reserves of smaller country banks across America. When rural banks pulled their cash back home for the harvest, New York banks faced an immediate liquidity crunch, causing interest rates to spike from a calm 2% to a frantic 40 or 100% overnight. The system lacked elasticity. It could not expand when cash was desperately needed, and it could not contract when there was too much speculation. Wall Street financiers, politicians, and academics watched in mounting dread, realizing that America's economic engine was growing too fast for its primitive tracks. Single shock could derail the whole locomotive. They began quietly plotting a way to reinvent American finance, and they just needed the right crisis to convince a skeptical public. In 1907, they got it. Act 3. The Storm. The Panic of 1907. October 1907 brought a financial earthquake to Wall Street. The immediate catalyst was a reckless, failed scheme by two speculators, F. Augustus Heinz and Charles W. Morse, who tried to corner the market in United Copper Company stock. When their scheme collapsed, it dragged down the State Savings Bank of Butte, Montana, and sent shockwaves through New York City's financial network. At the center of the storm were trust companies, shadowy, fast-growing institutions that operated like banks but were subject to far fewer regulations. When depositors heard that the massive Knickerbocker Trust Company, the second largest trust in the country, was tied to the failed copper speculators, panic set in. Lines formed outside the doors of the Knickerbocker Trust. Men and women pushed, shoved, and wept, clutching their passbooks, desperate to pull out their life savings before the vault slammed shut. In hours, millions of dollars vanished. The Knickerbocker collapsed, and the panic spread like wildfire to other trust companies and banks. With the government in Washington paralyzed and no central bank to inject cash into the system, J. Pierpont Morgan stepped in. As the ultimate Wall Street titan, Morgan locked the doors of his grand library on Madison Avenue, summoned the heads of New York's richest banks and trust companies into a room, and locked the heavy doors behind them until they pooled their own fortunes to rescue the crumbling financial system. Morgan forced them to pledge millions to guarantee liquidity, stationed guards, and shipped bags of gold in horse-drawn carriages under the cover of night, essentially acting as a private central bank. The panic subsided, but the trauma remained. For decades, historians and critics have debated the true nature of 1907. Was it purely organic? The inevitable result of a flawed banking structure? Or was it, at least in part, an engineered panic? Critics and economic historians have noted a compelling narrative. Wall Street elites, desperate for a government-sanctioned central bank to protect them from future runs, stood to benefit enormously from a terrifying public collapse. Whether the crisis was deliberately nudged along or merely exploited, the result was absolute. The message echoed across the halls of power: never again could the nation rely on a private citizen like J.P. Morgan to save the United States. Act 4. The Shadow Summit on Jekyll Island, World War I, and the birth of the Federal Reserve. In the wake of the 1907 panic, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, creating a temporary emergency currency and establishing the National Monetary Commission. At the head of this commission was Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, a Republican political powerhouse, a close ally of the House of Morgan, and the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., making him the ultimate representative of Wall Street interests in Washington. But public distrust of Wall Street was so intense that any bill carrying Aldrich's name was instantly doomed in the court of public opinion. A clandestine strategy was required. The secret summit on Jekyll Island. In November 1910, Senator Aldrich slipped out of Washington in absolute secrecy. He boarded a private, chartered railroad car bearing the luxurious private carriage of J.P. Morgan, accompanied by a small, hand-picked cadre of America's most elite bankers and monetary theorists. Their destination was an exclusive, wealthy retreat off the coast of Georgia, the Jekyll Island Club. To the outside world, the men claimed they were heading south for a quiet duck hunting trip. To ensure the press and local staff remained completely oblivious, they operated under strict instructions. Use first names only. There were no senators, no senior vice presidents, and no banking titans in the lodge. Only Nelson, Paul, Frank, and Henry. The participants represented the absolute zenith of American and European financial power. Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. The political architect and head of the National Monetary Commission, representing the legislative muscle and the direct interests of the Rockefeller and Morgan empires, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company and a brilliant European-trained financier who had spent years studying central banks. Warburg was the intellectual godfather of the entire scheme, having authored papers arguing that America desperately needed a centralized reserve system modeled after the Reichsbank of Germany or the Bank of England. Frank Vanderlip, the president of the National City Bank of New York, the largest bank in the United States at the time, and a primary pillar of the Rockefeller Financial Group. Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, representing the immense power, capital, and global reach of the House of Morgan. Charles D. Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York. Another vital Morgan-aligned institution, Arthur Piatt. Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, brought along to provide official government data, statistics, and technical administrative backing, Benjamin Strong, a trusted lieutenant to J.P. Morgan, who would later become the powerful first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. For over a week, locked away behind closed doors on the secluded island, these men hammered out the precise mechanics of America's new financial master plan. They designed a centralized reserve association divided into regional districts capable of issuing elastic currency, holding commercial bank reserves, and setting discount rates. Crucially, while they dressed the plan up in populist rhetoric about decentralization, the core control of the institution remained firmly in the hands of the private bankers who funded it. The legislative pivot and the holiday trap. When Aldrich finally brought the resulting blueprint back to Washington as the Aldrich Plan, the public backlash was swift and brutal. Populists, progressive politicians, and agrarian reformers immediately recognized it for what it was, a Wall Street trap designed to enshrine private banking monopolies under a government-sanctioned badge. The bill stalled and died in Congress. Despite the setback, the momentum for a central bank was unstoppable. When Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, the Democrats took control of the narrative. Led by Congressman Carter Glass and Senator Robert Owen, they took the core architecture drafted on Jekyll Island, repackaged it, and added a crucial political veneer, a government-appointed Federal Reserve Board in Washington, whose members would be chosen by the president, to create the illusion of public oversight. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law under the cloak of holiday distraction. This financial machinery unlocked the exact mechanism required for modern endless warfare. Because historically, nations were limited by how much physical gold they possessed. Under the old gold standard rules, European powers would have bled themselves dry and been forced to make peace within months. But the Federal Reserve changed the laws of economic gravity. By creating an elastic, fiat-based currency backed by the power to monetize government debt, it gave Wall Street an infinite pool of credit. When World War I erupted 7 months later, American banks were suddenly able to write massive checks and underwrite billions in war bonds for the Allies. Without the Federal Reserve's capacity to conjure credit out of thin air, European powers would have run out of money by 1915, choking off the war before it could truly consume a generation. Instead, the Fed became the invisible financial engine that transformed a regional European conflict into an industrial slaughterhouse, proving that the most powerful institution in modern history wasn't built to save America from panics, but to fund the wars of the 20th century.